What do YouTube? What did he say? What's going on? Are you sure? But the good news is, what's where it is. So I'm reading from Psalm 81, Psalm of Asaph, and it say, "Hear, O my people, and I will admonish you, O Israel, if you will listen to me. There shall be no foreign god among you, nor shall you worship any foreign god. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it." But my people would not heed my voice, and Israel would have none of me. So I gave them over to their own stubborn heart, to walk in their own counsels. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would soon subdue their enemies. I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries. The haters of the Lord would pretend submission to him, but their fate would endure forever. He would have fed them also with the finest of wheat, and with honey from the rock. I would have satisfied you. And now look at Psalm 83, verse 6. It says, "The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gebal, Ammon, Amalek, Philistia, and the inhabitants of Tyre. Assyria has joined with them, and their children. They have helped the children of Lot." So we say deal with them as Midian, as with Sisera. This is with the judges, Sisera, JL. Check out Sisera. And it say right here in verse 12, it say, "Who said, let us for ourselves the pastures of God for possession." It said, "Oh my God, make them like whirling dust, like the chaff before the wind, as the fire burns the woods, and the flame sets mountains to the fire. Pursue them with your tempest." And I wanted to look at real quick Genesis 49, verse 5. It says, "Simeon and Levi," and if you know, these brothers had gone out against Shechem when he was going to marry one of the daughters of Israel. And we know one of the sons of Israel, Joseph, he married Egyptian women. But seems like unthinkable, that a male line would, it could be somewhat unthinkable. Rebecca would say, don't even on the female line, but on the male line, this would be so unthinkable. It wasn't even if they converted. I believe that's a addition from a later source. Genesis 37 and thereabouts. Was it Genesis 36? So it says here in verse 5, Simeon and Levi are brethren, weapons of violence, their kinship. Let my soul not come into their counsel. Unto the assembly let my glory not be united. For in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they held oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob, I will scatter them in Israel. So Simeon ended up becoming part of Judea and such, and so would Levi and whatnot, but that's a little unclear. Some say, in Chronicles it indicates that if they were good priests, they would have came down when the Syrians came and joined in, inside the gates of safety or whatever. But that's neither here nor there. I said that, I read all that to just say, these aren't like these enemies in Psalm 83 are the nations, but these ones who, you know, he gave them over to their own stubborn hearts, that they would walk in their own ways. He would have subdued their enemies, but so the haters of the Lord would pretend submission to him, but they wouldn't, they ended up following the foreign gods. And I think that if you say the foreign gods are the Baals, yes, that's true, but I fear that it wouldn't have a too basic understanding. It's in a different place in the Hebrew as it is in the Greek, but in Hosea, it had said, "You shall no longer call me Bali, you shall call me Ishi." And they've taken this and run with it. I first came across this. I didn't know it was so easy. I didn't have a subsidized JPS of my own at the time. So I used to go to the Jewish library, and I used to go in all the what you call it, like just the basic Tanakh, and I looked around the tractates and stuff and whatnot, but there was I would just look for there. I had no idea. You got to understand, this boy was raised in the Catholic Church, right? So I just had, oh, help me. I just had a Catholic Bible. I don't know. I could just look. I was over in a Jewish library trying to figure this out when I could have just got a KJV. So all y'all Protestants, you don't even know what I'm talking about. This came a totally different way to you and to a Jewish person as well, because they don't get it how it is said anyways. They was looking at it through, like, if you go to 2 Samuel, what I want to say like 16 or there about. I don't know right now, but I have it underlined if I just find my Catholic Bible. Shoot, while I'm here, if I'm gonna say it, I might as well. When we talk about the cookies, might as well bring them. So I think I did underline. I was just talking about this yesterday to a friend. So you can find it for yourself in 2 Samuel. Sorry about the loud page turn. I know that probably sounds a lot louder on there than over here, but you go to Second. I didn't know what page it was on. 2 Samuel 19 verse 26, for instance. And there's lots of examples. This is one of Saul's kids, but you can find the same in David's kids. You just look, and there, bam, it says Mephibosheth. Well, you look at this 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 26, in the Catholic Bible, and it's a Maryball. And most the differences would be between Bosheth and Baal. And I guess Bosheth even came into Yiddish, to where they're just calling everything that is like the nations or whatever just Bosheth, and that's how they view the cleanliness laws. The cleanliness laws made them better, and they were going to enlighten the nations and to be like setting apart. And then when everyone else follows their cleanliness laws, then they could be saved in a similar way, but not the same. They get the lowest. The convert gets the lowest place in the world to come, but still has a place. But nonetheless, I didn't really want to get too much into that before first doing a little bit of a study of Semitic language, going back to Chaldean and all that. Well, Arabic and Hebrew both come from the large influence of the Chaldees and the Persians, much like the English compared to the French. Changing their language wasn't a big deal, but like you go to West Africa, and everyone's speaking French. But with uh, Hebrew and Aramaic, especially coming from Abrahamic faith, you would expect to see some similarities. And if I may just show you this right quick, in the Quran, you have right here. So that first letter here is a bay, and then this next letter is a sin. So you have a ba sin, and then a meh. So then you have like this one line over here is like an aleph, then you have a couple lameds, and then the he. And so what that say is Bismillah. So the B, you can tell by this dot right there. And the S, it's hard to see, but it's got like three little lines. Like if you look at the Hebrew Shin, which I believe is the ancient Semitic one, so that's why they show it all over the place. And that's why they talk about Shem. Shem is the progenitor of the Shemitic people who, for a lot of simple discourse, could be put as a proxy to the J haplogroup, which would say originated in Arabia, but I think that is false. I think that there's been a lot of replacements of populations, and you might see the strongest indication in the Arabian Peninsula, but that's because there wasn't a lot of I guess admixture. There is going to be admixture, but there's not going to there's going to be a predominance of a particular group. What dwelled deep into the desert, and this is going back to a long period ago, namely, at the time of the Syrians, basically, and so what's really hard to understand is how they could spread it through the female population. And to understand this, you have to understand something that's true of both steppe people, the Russian steppes, as well as nomadic people that are shepherds. Notice how the people of Egypt, disdained shepherds, and that they were matrilineal. And I don't want people to think it's like, the Amazon woman, that it's, matriarchal. It could be quite the opposite, that they put undue burden on women to keep sexual purity and proper fidelity of the children, as well as religion of the children, while the men are absent on merchant expeditions and things like that. Who knows if they'd ever return, of all the dangers of having very little police. I mean, there's lots of police in the city, like Egypt would have police and stuff, but as you go on these long journeys, even if you go into being a stranger in someone else's land, like let's say Abraham was being a stranger, the law might not be in his favor. They would weigh out things. So they would have something called met, which was how good your acts are under the law. And that's something I find kind of problematic with the way people interpret Christianity as well as Islam. And it's all about right action. And that's where I would take issue with a lot of people who think Acts of the Apostles is something that applies now. The problem they have is they don't realize is that time period was something that was not yet, but still was. It was something that was dying, had its mortal wound, but still was there. And that's why you'll see all these cleanliness laws, like in Acts 15, because that was what would set people apart, is this cleanliness. And that was also somewhat of a claim to fame, because other nations had rules, forbidding murder and other things that the law has, but there's certain things that were particular, and some of those things in particular go way before the time of Moses. And this has to do with, I think, what you would call the Hebrew people, or the Hyksos, and how kind of in around the 15th century BC, Egypt was controlled by a Semitic people. And this may have been when the Egyptians were, the pyramids were built. But the problem that the biblical writers would find is that the pyramids are clearly to the Baals, and with the obelisks and what have you. So they would have to say that they were strangers there. Gershom, in Goshen, he named his son Gershom, because they were strangers there. And so this gets a lot to do with the 400 years. It wasn't slavery, because the Hyksos actually ruled it. So they had married in at first matrilineally into the pharaonic house, and eventually were a predominant people, and they were the ones who could hewn the hard stone, capable enough to build the pyramids. That kind of metal wasn't in Egypt before then. There were no chariots before then. And even in the Hyksos period, they haven't really found those chariots, but towards the end of the Hyksos period, maybe. And for whatever reason, it just became clear that you couldn't call the Egyptian pyramids, something that you built, that you would have to spin the narrative that you were the engineer or the slave. They forced you to do it, but because you were a stranger there, they weren't following your gods. There was a god they didn't know. And so this is people who would be under the same kind of curses that all the Noahide curses, that they were nations that whatchamacallit, maybe if I go back to where I was going at with Acts 10, they say they inherited lies from their fathers, it says in Jeremiah. And what's it say? So I went to you immediately, and you have done well to come. Now, therefore, we are all present before God to hear the things commanded you by God. Then Peter opened his mouth and said, in truth, I perceive that God shows no partiality, but in every nation that fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him. The word of God is sent to the children of Israel, preaching peace through Jesus Christ. He is Lord of all. That word, which was proclaimed throughout all Judea and began in Galilee after the baptism which John preached, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit, with power, who went doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. And we are witness of all the things he did, and both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, from which they killed by hanging on a tree. Him God has raised on the third day and showed him openly, not to all the people, but to witnesses chosen before God, not to all people, even to us who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people, to testify that it is he who was ordained by God to judge the living and the dead. And I don't think this is like, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, even though that is a very old source, that, some will be changed in the twinkling of an eye. That's a way to look at it, and it may be talking about the same thing in a sense. Especially if you really metaphoricalize 1 Corinthians 15 like I do, then I would really say, it's the same thing. So you would say less so than I would. But I think it's just the scales. Jesus is the scales by which we can measure all things. So all things will be determined to be good or bad by how the man Jesus Christ lived, because he will be raised up, with him being raised up, like in death, he'll draw him into himself, like that. He's going to, in his death, be stumbling block to a lot of people. But when we can realize the glory of his life, then he's God. He was always God, but we didn't get it. You know what I mean? And so, but the thing is, you got to understand what I was saying about Psalms 83 about the pastures of God. And they believed that they were God's chosen people. So when you have this hyper seed doctrine, that really, this is what Acts 10 is all about, and that's what was a problem I was saying about Genesis 49. That you have this, like, seed doctrine or whatever, and say, Acts 10:28, then he say unto them, how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company with and go to one of who's another, but God says not to call anybody common who God called, uncommon. And so what you have is a situation where if Christians worship Christ or revere Christ, and Buddhists revere Buddha, who do people of Judaism revere? And when they go out into the wilderness in a tent, they put themselves in a tent, even commemorate being in a tent. And what do you call it? Ohel, and like a tabernacle. And when they say the Canaanites would see the 1 Samuel 14, 1 Samuel 4, oh, God's with them. God is with, God's in that camp. So yeah, they can say, oh, they brought the tabernacle, but they would even go as far as to say that God went to exile with them, and from Ezekiel talking about the presence going to the east, and which is very remarkable, because they'll say Ezra is inspired and true and right and all that, when we don't really see the presence coming back with Ezra. And so it was like nobody said anything, and then here comes Ezra, pulling people's hair out, doing a lot, really. And when it comes to Acts 10, there's this point where Peter goes up to Cornelius, and Cornelius gets down on his blooming face and is prostrate, doing obeisance to Peter. And Peter says, no, I'm just a man. And there's a weird symmetry in X, where it kind of builds up to the point where it hits a fever pitch of getting rejected by God's people in his own area, and goes out into the nations, just as Luke ends, go from Judea and Samaria and on out to the nations, and so in this process of going out into the world, being 28 chapters of 31 verse, the pivot, if in terms of dividing it perfectly in half, is again a similar situation to somebody bowing to Peter, where the nations were bowing to Paul. And so they would say, in the name of God, what's God doing? Well, they would say when the nations all get punished, when Rome submits to a small nation, the biggest nation of the world, the New World Order, when they submit to a small little nation, and their God is, the God of the nations, meaning Rome, the whole empire, then, will order be shalom, and only the tzaddik would have the place in the world to come. But right now you have the wicked, living amongst them, and God was going to judge between right and wrong. And because they believed this, whenever Messiah comes along, they were ready to go to loggerheads. They were, Bar Kokhba, oh hell yeah, that's the Messiah. Let's go fight because God's on our side, just like when the day of the Maccabees, just like it with Hezekiah, you're going to have 185,000 dead, just like that, because God's on your side, 10,000, whatever, doesn't matter. And so here come Peter, when they go to arrest Jesus, he go cut off Malchus's ear. Well, Jesus said in John 19, if my kingdom were this world, my people would rise up and fight, and Peter in Acts 1:6 was ready for it to pop off. He was feeling some kind of way about the Romans, supposedly, which probably they called the Esau and Amalek, and you probably use all these code words because it's probably illegal to talk about Caesar and Rome and everything. So in the garrisons or the legions or whatever, so they probably called him, Esau or Amalek or what have you, Canaan or anything, and so as I was saying about the Bismillah, that's why if you look at the title, I don't have, it just says blank. It says Bashem, the Hebrew letter Bayet gets contracted into the word Shem, the progenitor of all of the Shemitic people, Shem, the name, Hashem. Well, the interesting thing about Aleph is it's a pausa. It makes no sound. And as I showed you in the Arabic, the Aleph just drops right out. When you translate it into English, you say, in the name of Allah, but you don't say in the Hebrew. It's because it's an Aleph, and it's implied. A lot of words where you have the al is the prefix, there will actually be a lamed in there. Those are what we call al-Shams words, sun words. And Akamar, the lamed just drops right off. And all you left was the aleph. And I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if that Shem is a Kamar word, Dabar or whatever, and so the Aleph doesn't make a sound and can fall right off, and you just have the B and then the S. The scene is what I believe is the only S in Hebrew. In terms of ancient Hebrew, in terms of you know, Aramaic, you know, the for whatever reason, for the Hebrew Aramaic, and they had to get the Semek from Sigma, and or for whatever reason, it wasn't a very popular letter. That they distinguished themselves, I think, the Cadians, largely by making S sounds into SH sounds. So I think that was more of a regional thing, that they didn't really have an S sound. And to say words that other people were saying, they added it into the abajad or abagad. And so so it doesn't say anything. It just says in the name and then blank. Because they say Bashem, you know, in the name, but then they don't say anything. They just call him the name. Well, the name is actually the prefix to a prayer. You can't just say, they're not saying anything. They do the same with, they'll make you think that it's you know, they just can't say it, but they're saying it. So to translate it into English, it becomes incomprehensible. They'll just write God with a dash or Lord with a dash over the O, and just to show this. But it's more of a technicality. You have to understand that Abraham never knew the name Yahweh. That and there's hundreds and hundreds of years in between Abraham and Moses, and you know, you can't blame Abraham for that, for just being a product of what his knowledge was from his area, being that he was from the nations and everything. So technically, I think they know that if you went back linguistically, the God would be the Baals. And that's why you have to say, you no longer call me Bali. It wasn't that they were calling him another God. They knew who they were talking about, because God wasn't something well known. They were figuring it out. They're trying to tell people who God was, and part of the way to do that is to take parts of all these different other gods and bring them together. And one thing I think that was very true of the Yahwehistic source was to say that they are all one, like the Trinity. You have all these different gods, and you know, there's a saying in Islam, like, you can't have gods fighting each other. You can't have, this is something that's true about the Greeks. There's a certain amount of entropy in polytheism. That in polytheism, one god's will could be up against another's god's will. But you have the same thing in rabbinical kind of stuff, or priestly stuff, let's say. Not rabbinical, priestly, let's say, like Zechariah and all that. When we talk about the time where this character was formed called Satan, the Shaitan, who is more fully getting revealed, as we saw in Acts 10. We see that how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and the power, who went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil. So the devil was the real enemy. So if they believe that God was basically what they were doing, because you know, it's inherent in the belief. So I'm going to, in my next video, which may be tomorrow morning, because I didn't do proper research, is about this man from well over 1,000 years ago, who I find absolutely fascinating. This thing he said. His name was Johannes Scotus Erogen or whatever. His name basically means John, uh, Irish or something. And he was like a Gael or something, and he was like a bald headed monk. And he had this interesting theory. So he basically said that the world was created. Let me just pull it up. Hold this ain't too low. So I was just searching God as the universe because I was, you know, part of me in my other video where we're talking about the universe bless you. I hadn't done my research. That I hadn't looked at on Wikipedia, and this guy's picture come right up in the dictionary for this question. Is his face right there? So he talks about these four steps of the world, and I find this absolutely fascinating. And this dude's a Christian, I believe. So don't be acting like I'm trying to spin y'all into some non-Christian kind of thing. And so his argument followed from the pseudo Dionysius and from the Neoplatonists. So if you like history, some of these Platonic ideas can be quite fascinating. And I believe that Christianity, as according to the Nag Hammadi Codex, may have had variant forms as early as the Orthodox forms in Gnosticism, where the demiurge was the god of the Old Testament, and the flesh was inherently kind of evil. So to give up the flesh was a sign of good, and this is where martyrdom comes from, and that is not from Christianity, but from I showed you in my video around Christmas about the Maccabees and how there was a woman of seven sons who talked about martyrdom and resurrection and all that, and transcending all of it. And so we have this dude. He say there's four steps for God, basically, and the first is like a very Calvinistic kind of Old Testament-y, that there's an election, that there's a creator, and go fruit, be fruitful and multiply, and all that. So let me read it to you. That first one is that which creates and is not created. That is the first form of God, So this gets into what I was saying about the schema of God being changed from Baal to Yahweh to Jesus, and not being different gods, but being different ways to view God, and not that it's all in a name. No, the characteristics are becoming increasingly benign and peaceable, and for the second one, it says that which is created and creates, and I think this is where Israel is, like in the Old Testament. That they are going to be as numerous as the sands of the sea, that they are going to subdue the nations and make their culture supreme and everything. And so I think Jesus as a man is this third one, that which is created and does not create. So Jesus as a man, it wasn't his will per se, just kind of born into this world cold, lonely, hungry, whatever happens to us. We feel every kind of way as humans. So he was created and doesn't create. He didn't have any children. So to somebody like Judas, he was kind of not even the Messiah anymore. Just kind of like, well, if you're not going to create, if you're not going to help us with number two, then you're now part of us. You're not the Messiah. And Peter was on this game too. And number 4 is that which neither is created nor creates. And this is Jesus as God, and Jesus as God was never created. He, the Word was always there, from the beginning. And yet still he doesn't create. There is this crucifixion of the flesh that he's teaching all people to, just forsake the world. And so I believe that the second coming of Jesus has a lot to do with the destruction of the second temple, when every knee bowed, when they no longer could say that they had something to say, because so this is the confusing part, because as I said in a prior video about the same time period about Christmas, that Jesus is not a provable history. And inasmuch, I just saw a remarkable point from a PBS documentary about Jesus, that the authors of each gospel would not be worried about how they line up, with one another as a perfect, story, because it was never intended to be read that way. And that the temple, like if the gospel accounts were written in the 2nd century, that the destruction of the temple was a given. And so in the destruction of the temple, and the spreading of the gospel, because we know the first, even if the gospels were not written until the 2nd century, that clearly Paul's letters in the Christian churches were started by the 1st century. So there was already this belief in this man who had some great purpose, and what was this great purpose? It wasn't to create. No, he carried his cross and was poured out for others. He was a servant. So what Peter say, as God, or sorry, what Paul say. Okay, let me back it up. So I want to show you a bunch from Acts 10, but I don't remember what it was. So what is this? What is this God that they wanted all the Christians to be under this God? This was the whole point. This was what gave them justification to be set apart, to be different, to be privileged. That when the one day would come, that everybody would be learning from them. Well, guess what happened? Guess what happened? All these nations, like the whole Roman Empire, is now under this light. They are all following the God of Israel. So they did. It was in the name of God. So this is something Peter talked about, that all who believes in him, through his name. It says here in verse 43 that all through his name. Well, it's not like you just have to know the name Yahusha or Jesus or whatever it is, because the name is the office. That's why they open all these prayers with Bashem, because it's calling to his office. It's, believe it or not, taking the Lord's name in vain. It's basically like, I call upon God. It's basically summoning or casting a spell, using white magic, and so this is something Moses was very good at. This is how he beat the priests of the Egyptians, as using white magic against their black magic. And whether Solomon was using white magic or black magic is highly debated amongst Muslims and Yahudim. So through this name, here God was telling Hosea to tell the people they will no longer call him Baali, but he didn't say you'll no longer call to the Baalis. It's in his name. It's not directed to him. But it's not that you're saying it. You're not summoning. It's just you're calling upon that greater authority. You're speaking it into life. Like, not that you can speak things into existence or anything, but oh yeah. I have derailed. So okay, let me try to get back on track. So Sid Roth, I just saw this video. He's got a little talk show, and Sid Roth said, "I can't stand Christians that just can't listen to what the Lord has said." And this is often the perspective of those that believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and those are the same people that believe in election and stuff like that. And when you try to press them on election and stuff like that, and the role of Israel and stuff, they'll always point you back to the Old Testament. They can't really show you in the New Testament where that is, where you're saved by works and stuff like that. And I can show you in Acts 10 where it says, was it Acts 9? Okay, verse 35, it say, but every nation, whoever fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him. So you got this kind of like pseudo dual covenant that there's faith and works, which isn't true. This is something James hardly even got, unless he was just interpreting what Paul said in a different kind of way. But if he's going to say that work saves you, he's contradicting what Paul says. But this was in a time where the temple was still standing and people hadn't quite got it. And I don't think Luke really got it. Luke wasn't there. And Luke doesn't understand what the law was about in the first place. Luke wasn't one of them. And I don't think Luke even has a clear understanding of what Paul was doing. Because he's saying that he immediately went to Jerusalem after going to Damascus for a few days after getting some food or something. When Paul will tell you he went 14 years in Arabia after 3 years in Damascus, 3 years in Arabia, then in Damascus, and then to Jerusalem, and back to 14 years in Arabia, or whatever it is. That you got y'all always put me in an awkward position where I'm like criticizing the Bible, so I'm the bad guy. And then here's Luke saying they're all filled with the Spirit, and yet Peter's still under the impression he can't even eat at a gent's house or even be in his company. So the I would say the pivot point when we go up to Acts 14. Acts 14:15, it says, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men just the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God." And this is what Yahweh means, living God, who, it's not a proper name. Like when I showed you the Bismillah, they'll tell you Allah is a proper name. But I can show you how the component parts that make it. Y'all think I'm just hateful, so I can't even talk anymore. So critical. Who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all the things in them? Who in bygone generations? That was what I was looking for earlier. I've done read so much of 10. That's why I gotta plan ahead better. When I was looking for verse 16 of chapter 14. So this is the pivot that I was talking about. Who in bygone generations allowed nations to walk in their own ways. So, this was in bygone generations. There were people who were saved, and allowed to walk in their own ways from all nations under false gods and everything, as much as they hated to admit it. But their idea of who gets saved and who is not, they happen to wrap up into the law. And so what you read of this problem is, if so, if they see favor, then they were doing right, and if they don't see favor, they were doing wrong. But here's the problem. It's reverse, because they wait to go. They'll first march into war, and then if they win the war, they'll say God loved us, God favored us, this and that, and they got it all backwards. They try to prove it, and so when the Romans all accepted their God and bowed under one of them, Jesus and Paul and Peter and everything, well, guess what? Their God defeated all the pagan gods. So it served the purpose that they were looking for. So they can't kind of complain that no, you didn't listen to us. I go video after video where I talk about the Old Testament. I got their subsidized JPS. Yeah, I read from it all the time. I read it from them more than they do. I wouldn't be least bit surprised if some Jewish person has come across one of my videos and saw a part of Torah that maybe once. I'm not going to say this happens all the time, but maybe once. And I'm not going to say they've ever happened once, but got a little bit of milk from me, even like they used to from Moses. And so they're not necessarily experts on Torah, any more than a Christian would be, so then and like I showed you in Psalms 81, time and time again, weren't exactly doing right or walking the law. And as Peter said, we can't keep the law. And then, Peter keeps on witnessing that, they were saved before they got the law. As that was the reason for in Acts 15, they didn't need the law. And that they were saved apart from the law, therefore. And guess what? So is the people under the law. They're saved apart from the law too. And so this is what Acts is all about. And the pivot point is how all these people had believed the lies of their fathers, and now they're bowing to Jewish people, doing obeisance, and here's Paul, by the end of the book, on his way on a boat, Godspeed in all haste to Caesar himself to preach to him the God of the Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or whatever. And so, and then over time, this became their God too. So everything that Israel was worried about, how they need to show the nations who God was, and that if the nations overpowered them, that their God would be lost to all history, and then everybody would be missing what they had to share, doesn't seem to add up. It's 2,000 years later, and there are billions and billions of people who know the law quite well, and but they would want you to believe that if they beat the Rome, if they like they thought they did at one time at Beth Horon, for a moment, that if they thought that they beat Rome, they would think that God was doing it. So when Rome willingly accepts to submit to their God, that's not right, but if they were to submit to their God by force, then it would be right, supposedly. And because they have a kind of aggrandizing view of God that when that they're basically the ones in the tent when they're saying God's in a tent, and they're the ones on the battlefield when they're saying God's on the battlefield, and in that way, there is this evolution from pantheism into deism. As I was kind of getting into with Scott, I'll have to research that more. But if God was all these different component parts, kind of being in the middle of the world, you would get knowledge of all the different ways God would be represented, to have priests that were very sophisticated in the ways of using ritual to seem that they're bringing mystical experiences to people's lives, and representing the gods as intermediaries, and that they were kept from their own families and everything to do the service, and therefore they deserve some money and everything like that. Now, the problem with I'm tired. This video has been like an hour. I'm gonna have to save this for another time. I don't even know where I'm going. Okay, this is from the Quran. It says, "And we revealed Musa's mother, saying, 'Give him suck. Then, when you fear for him, cast him into the river, and do not fear nor grieve. Surely we will bring him back to you, and make him one of the apostles.' And Pharaoh's family took him, that he might be an enemy, and grieve for them. Surely Pharaoh and Haman and their hosts were wrongdoers." And Pharaoh's wife said, "I don't know. I'll have to think about all this some more and get back to you. Peace."